to know the community, you need to put yourself in positions to be known in the community. And that in its own right is a reciprocal experience. So yeah, that was a good sort of deviation there, Joe. Hope I gave it some justice.
No, I think you did. And I'll tell you my story some other time about how I became a member of the Grange and actually the chaplain of the Grange, which is pretty amusing if you know me, in Vermont. No, these are the ways we get to know a community. And I think the other thing I'd like to hear you talk about, this is all very interesting, I think. You know, you're a teacher. At the end of the day, you're an educator. And, you know, you have executive functions with the Center for Community Engagement, et cetera. But at the end of the day, you're an educator. And as were we all. And, you know, Parker Palmer talks about the personal and the professional, right? And that those two cannot and should not be separated. I'm paraphrasing. That's reactions. I think that's what he means.
Yeah, I'm very familiar with what you're talking about, personal and professional.
Yeah. And you're also in the same neck of the woods as the Highlander Center with our hero, Miles Horton, right? And these things, and Paulo Freire then comes in as a triangulation. I mean, at the end of the day, we're really talking about making connections with people and you know, exposing ourselves as human beings. We're not simply cold professionals who are working with students. That's at least what a lot of us are not interested in whatsoever. We're interested in making connections with our students on a personal level, with the community on a personal level, and that's when things get interesting. And can you talk about some experiences you've had? I mean, and I'm, you know, there may have been some missteps there. I sure have a few stories, you know, but I'm not asking you to share your missteps, but
we learn more from those than any successes. That's for sure.
I would say. But can you talk about some of those experiences where you were beginning to get to, you know the community and put yourself out as a community member or a would-be community member, being from outside? In Vermont, anyone where I taught for 20 years was anyone from outside was a flatlander. So, you know, you're branded from the beginning, you know, and as one old-time Vermonter put it one time, and it's funny because my son was born in Vermont, is that just because a cat has its biscuits in the oven, how's this go? Just because the cat has kittens in the oven, don't make them biscuits. Something like that. You get the meaning.
I get it, and I can relate to that.
I'm sure that's a Appalachian, Western Carolina kind of thinking. But
and it's because they're proud of this particular history and geography, and you know what I mean. And I think there's real value in that.
Yeah.
And you want to try to sort of maintain that to whatever degree you can, but then also being open arms to new people and new ideas that are coming in. And I've expressly felt that. That's why I say I might not ever be from Western North Carolina, but I can absolutely say I am of Western North Carolina, because it has shaped me far more than I could ever begin to shape Western North Carolina. And the same is true with New Zealand, and arguably the same is true with Oklahoma, but I'm from Oklahoma, right? Truly. Preposition proper, I am from Oklahoma and will forever be from Oklahoma. And so that's, I would say I have red dirt in my bones in some capacity, right? From being from Oklahoma, even having lived in New Zealand and fallen in love with that place, and living in Western North Carolina and falling in love with this place. And it has more to do with the geography of the places, and it has far more to do with the people of the places. Like you mentioned earlier, the relationships that are built in places and spaces. And I also spent 5 years in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia, growing up, and I can say the same is absolutely true from my experience there, in the people and the places and the different cultures and nuances that I was able to grow up with from the ages of 10 to 15. All of that has fundamentally shaped me as someone. I used to think about being shaped in the past tense, and as I get older, I realize, and I have more experience, I'm like, there's no past tense to shaped. It's continual. It's shaping. Always you're being shaped by your environment, and so too is your environment being shaped by you as you're growing and investing your most precious commodity, your time, the only non-renewable resource, the time we've spent here, 28 minutes to the second. None of us are getting that back. That's truly the most important non-renewable resource that exists in our world. And I'm not taking away from climate change or any of that stuff, because there's some major issues there we can circle back to. But I'm saying for you as an individual, the time you have is a precious commodity. And where you choose to invest that is where you can then create and get change, right? You always get change when you spend your time. I love that concept. And so you were asking for specific moments or examples where maybe I'm trying to go back to like a point in story where I was in a community space and I felt like, wow, I really am starting to feel more of this space because of some moment. And I love moments like that because they're sort of incendiary, you know, they're like things that you could keep burning inside of you forever. But, you know, I think that it's more gradual than that for me. And I think that speaks volumes to the amount of time, you know, 10 years, this is my first position after I finished my formal education, as it were. I mean, informal education is far more sustained and important than even the formal at times. So I'm still very much informally learning every single day. But I think that the learning over the last 9 years here in Western North Carolina has been very gradual. And so I'm trying to signpost, am I pushing on the question that you've put out there, or do you want to sort of maybe rephrase it to where I can point towards again, like
well, I mean, you seem to be where you're going to be for a while. We don't know what the future holds, and I think you're framing it really well. I mean, I don't have the phraseology, but we become where we are at some point and we don't even see it happening. And at least that's my description. And sometimes we're not of where we are, but we find ways to cope with it. And that's a different thing. But I think what you're talking about echoes things I experience with my students. You're working with students who, you know, in my case, and probably your case, these kids, some of them had 7 generations going backwards in that place. And they hadn't frankly been a lot of other places. And, you know, and that's kind of mind boggling. But I think at some point you begin to morph into being part of it. I don't have the words for this, but.
No, you're pushing though, and you're getting me to think about specific examples. So my partner and I have done some research together talking about this concept of microcosms of experience, right? And so my partner is a post-university transition sort of expert. That's her area of research. She focuses on when students graduate from a university and then they move into life on the other side of that, what sort of experiences are they having? How can they be prepared for that? How can universities better make sure that they are going to transition? We're really good at transitioning seniors in high school to university, right? There's a lot of reasons why we've become very good at that, right? We want a retained student is a good student, and that's an important indicator for success of an institution's health is the retention of the students that you do get, right? But the other side of the stage, we don't spend as much time on. And so imagine that over here. And then my focus is on community engagement and service, primarily place-based education in a macro sort of sense. And I investigate what happens to the student experience around learning within a classroom. How do they grow personally around that? How do they grow with their commitment to civic and community commitment in the future? And so you have those pieces over here. And so we spend a lot of time together, right? We live in the same house. And we were realizing that a lot of the things that the folks she was interviewing, who were students who were graduated from university and trying to figure out their way through, it was literally dubbed treading through swampy water, was kind of how one of the students qualified their experience. And so that wound up being the title of her dissertation. But then we started looking at like, what is it like treading through that swampy water? And what sort of tools do those students see value in preparing them to better tread through that swampy water? And so I said, well, here's things that students are saying in this class that were valuable for them from the work I was doing on community engagement and service learning classes in New Zealand. And we sat down and we started cross-referencing this. So circling all the way back to this idea of microcosms of experience, one thing that we noted, some sort of anecdotal or even some conceptual connections around, were the students who had a deeply committed relationship with the community where their university was, right? Maybe they were a high-level lead volunteer with Habitat for Humanity over the years, or maybe they mentored a lot at the local school and grew into managing other mentors at that local school system, right? They were really investing, in just two examples there. When they moved away and they graduated and they got a job in another town or another city, one of their coping mechanisms was to lean into and invest into the similar organizations that existed into that community, right? And so that was a way of like people strive not to be only from places, but to be of places. And that's evolving. You can become of lots of places as we move. And anyone in higher education knows in order to move up, you got to move away, as we're just zeroing in on one industry. But this is true with lots of industries. You've got to move. People move quite often. But whenever you are focused on becoming of a place, you do that by way of serving in the community. That's been the key tool for me in Western North Carolina as a region, is connecting with every organization that I can, and not just doing the board level work, the behind the scenes work, but literally going out and rolling your sleeves up and getting involved in the frontline work that these community organizations are focused on. And you can't do either or, you've got to do all of that, in my opinion, if you're trying to truly invest yourself deeply into the community. And you get major returns when you do that. You have a renewed sense of pride in the place that you live, a renewed sense of pride in yourself. And these are the same messages I try to articulate to students. So circling back to wrap this point up, these microcosms of experiences is something my partner and I have been sort of bandying back and forth a little bit. And I've really picked up on this idea a lot and said, service learning and community engagement on university campuses with students can actually help prepare them for the other side of the stage. Not only retain them while they're here and help them with their GPA and learning better and to be a better ecologist or nurse or business person or teacher, but literally to actually have tools for coping with their own transition on the other side of the stage. And it's a little bit of a stretch at this point to sort of call it empirical. At this point, it is conceptual and observed, but it's emergent and it's interesting.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And, going back, if we hit rewind and we went back to March or April of last year, whenever it emerged on people's reality screens, we're in a very unpredictable time and a lot of crazy stuff, not to mention the political. We're not going to go there, but it's a time of very unpredictable stuff. And I saw at some point an article somewhere. I mean, it to me it was kind of a no-brainer, but basically that those who will thrive and survive in these times, these unpredictable times of chaos, whatever you want to call it, are people who thrive with chaos, and people who, whether you're talking about business or something else, people who thrive with unpredictable. And let's face it, that is not the model that school has been built upon. School has been built upon the predictable. But the one thing that strikes me in our conversation here is that when you get involved with real work with the community, real projects, you immediately, and if you're not doing this, you're not doing it right, in my humble opinion, you immediately engage with the unpredictable. And teachers who do project-based learning or service learning or place-based learning, whatever they may call it or think of it as, that are really deeply involved in projects in the community with their students, if you're not facing the unpredictable at some point, you're not really doing it. That's my humble opinion. And therefore, we're talking about introducing students to the unpredictable. And do you want to riff off that a little bit? I mean,
yeah, I hear unpredictable. I think of that being a way of qualifying an environment, right? And I think that we are in we've been in an extremely unpredictable environment. I mean, I think we always are, but it's just been exacerbated in the last 8-9 months. And unpredictability puts people into this headspace of sort of an external threat, and so when you're living in some constant and steady sort of headspace of a threat, that has an emotional take on a person. It can have an emotional hit on a person. But riffing further off your idea of this unpredictable environments, it really brings up to me the seminal work of Eiler and Giles when they asked, where's the learning in service learning, right? They asked this question and designed a whole entire research study and book around this question. At the end of the day, 250 some odd pages later, the bottom line, the thesis was, where's the learning in service learning? The learning is inherently in the questions that experiencers of service learning environments wind up asking that otherwise they would have never asked. And that, to me, unpredictability is a breeding ground for questions when you engage in it. And if there's anything that institutions of higher education are prepared, and other institutions of education generally, right? Like Community Works Institute is an institution of education, and higher education in K through 12 and everything in between, lifelong learning, the gift that keeps on giving for all of us. This idea, if there's anything that institutions like that are eminently qualified to do, it's to prepare people to ask informed questions. Because the information you're getting as an engineering student, by the time you graduate 4 years later, especially a computer engineering student, and I'd argue any engineering student for that matter, other than the just rote basics that you need to understand civil engineering or aeronautical engineering, most of the stuff has become dated, right? By the time you walk across stage. And so if the only reason a student is going to university is to capture a body of knowledge that is static, then we're wasting everyone's time, money, resources, and energies. So what is the purpose? Well, the purpose is to prepare students to be able to ask informed questions and to lifelong learn and evolve, right? That's the secret in all of this stuff. And if you look at anyone who has a terminal degree and anyone who doesn't for that matter, right? Terminal degrees are all inherently hinged in most cases on an informed research question that you're pursuing a new answer to that will probably temporarily be right or be a new link in the chain that will grow over time. But that's what universities are eminently qualified to do, is to get students of any discipline to be able to ask informed questions. And in the process of coming to the conclusions of those temporarily informed questions that are relevant, if in that process you can lead to temporary answers that are useful and can serve as a currency within the ecosystem that university plays in, the community, wider and local and even further afar, then you're actually doing good well, and it actually has a longer term benefit than just the learning alone. And so that's sort of like one of my points. You mentioned unpredictability, and it sort of spun me into this idea of questions being the key conduit to a university's purpose, which is to serve the larger good, and to do that by asking unanswered questions that are informed and pursuing new and temporary answers to that, and using that to advance knowledge in micro, meso, and macro ways across our world.
Well, I love the idea of, I mean, in terms of informing a learning project, Lane, I love the idea of, and basically, an unformed, there is no proper answer. That's what you're saying. And when we frame projects that have no exact proper answer versus a mathematical equation, although I'm sure you could frame a mathematical equation with an improper, no perfect answer, I think it becomes really important that that's what we're about. We're trying to get our students and ourselves as teachers to stretch our thinking and outside the box. And so let me take you back to, you've talked a lot about, the idea of, this relates to everything we're talking about, but the idea of developing a sense of civic involvement. When I was in school, civics was a pretty, dead world term, but I think it may have a comeback. We'll see. But I think the idea of civic involvement and democracy, and thinking of Paulo Freire and our friend Miles Horton at the Highlander Institute. How do these relate together, and why is this important for students? And how does it relate to the work that you care about, if that's not too broad a question?
I sort of think about the idea of, if you take a step back on the term civics, when I was in 8th grade, I took a civics class and it was very much a noun. But anyone who's seen civics, right, and contextualized civics in the last 8 years, 12 years, in the last 20 years, you can clearly see that civics is not a noun. It should not be considered a noun. Civics should absolutely be considered a verb, and a very bold action verb. Like civics, this whole concept is it's so quickly evolving, the never-ending news cycle, the extreme polarization that exists with where our constituent bases get put and how politicians have to frame their perspectives on things, I think really creates a difficult environment to engage what would be the sort of middle masses, the folks on the left who might lean a little right, and the folks on the right who lean a little left. And they sort of wind up, that's like a massive number of people, but they become disenfranchised due to this extreme polarization. And then your fringe becomes the margin and then infiltrate whole parties. And that's an interesting situation to watch. And more importantly than watching it, to be a part of it. Because again, if civics is a verb, you're sort of in the middle of all of that, and you're a part of it. And this is sort of one of the main areas of work we do at Western that kind of picks up on the signposts you offered a minute ago, is this idea of civic engagement, which for me, when you start to ask the question, to what ends of this work, to what ends of the purposes of universities and things like that, I take a step back and I'm like, okay, so we are preparing lots of people to make a difference in the world or in their community, or to be the best dang nurse, or to be the best dang philosopher, or the best dang teacher, or business person, or medical doctor, or whatever it is that they're being prepared to do. There's so much more than that. And the more than that for me is that every one of those professions that I just listed off, every one of the people who pursue those professions are going to be members of a community. And for me, that is, I want a nurse or a teacher who knows what they're doing, of course. That is, in my mind, prima facie almost for institutions. If you can't do that, then what are you doing, right? You're preparing them to be able to do this stuff well, and to be able to learn and evolve when they walk across stage, and to continue to be lifelong learners. You're doing all that stuff. But these are folks who are going to be members of our democracy and of our communities. And for me, that's the big sort of above the fold stuff. And I'm not saying that to take away from any of the disciplinary nature work that our students are being prepared to do, because that's also very important. But I think side by side is the civic with regard to the students, and learning to see that our late Chancellor, David Belcher at Western Carolina University, who passed away in 2017, made the comment and asking in sort of his one of his final concepts that he offered that really stuck with me is like, are you going to be a noun, or are you going to be a verb when it comes to service? Are you going to look at service as a noun? And I'll extend, are you going to look at civics as a noun? Or are you going to look at service and civics as a verb? Because once it's a verb, you can action it, you can act on it, you can be of it, similar to being of the community like we referenced earlier. So I think that's some, and we've done, and I want to signpost something here really quickly. We've done a ton of work at Western Carolina University around civic engagement with students, and we operationalize that work through our Student Democracy Coalition. We have partnerships with our local board of elections, with our local political parties. We partner with them. We bring candidates together. We have students engaging with them. We register voters. We help educate and inform voters. We bring a polling place to campus. I mean, there's a lot of movement in that ecosystem that gets really concrete. Everything at this point, and I feel almost guilty 45 minutes into our conversation of keeping things super abstract and broad brushstroke, because I see such value in the concrete. And so if there's any way we can pivot into that, I would love to reference a few more resources on some of the concrete work around civic engagement.
Well, no, the concrete is hugely important, Lane. Let's take a few minutes. Reference some concrete.
Yeah, so for me, we have the Student Democracy Coalition at Western Carolina University, and these students are made up of around 10 sort of students who are part of the leadership team. They're on educational stipends because the purpose of their work is educational first. And we've learned a few things that actually work when we're doing this when we're committing to engaging students in the civic space. To quickly take a step back, our Student Democracy Coalition exists to help register, inform, educate, and activate student voters on campus. So this is something, and we've seen this happen nationally, right? And you've seen our youth voting rates increase dramatically from 2016, there was around 45% of youth were registered to vote and voted. In 2020, it was nearly 55%. And so, and they also represented a larger percentage of all of the votes in a year where there were a lot more people who actually wound up voting. And so the students all the way down, I mean, that's national scale numbers there, but if you zero down a little bit more specifically to our Democracy Coalition at Western, and the work we do there, we've learned that if you can get clear support from upper administration, both in words and action, if you can have a continual presence of someone from a staff who wakes up thinking about this work every day and keeps a good pulse on it, on and off election cycles, because there's no off season, but there is on and off election cycles. If you can get data that can help validate results, that impact is being had with the time and energy that's being invested. If you can obtain support from external campus resources and have a core well-developed team of students who are willing to do this work, you can realize major results. And so at Western, what we've seen happen is in 2014, as a midterm example, there's a great study coming out of Tufts called the INSOL, which is the National Survey for Student Learning and Voting. And what this particular instrument does is it helps you determine what population, there's over 1,500 universities across the US who are part of this study. It tells you what percentage of your students are registered and how many of them actually went to the polls and voted in some capacity, whether they voted early voting or they voted absentee or they voted on election day. And it breaks down a substantial amount of information to give you a better pulse on where your students are voting, not how they're voting, of course, because that's private, but where they're voting and at what rates. And so one point I want to make from the work of the Student Democracy Coalition is in 2014. 2014 was an interesting year. It was a midterm, which there's always less interest around midterms because there's not presidential candidates on the ballot. That's a simple causation, unfortunately. But 2014 offered the lowest voting rate with youth specifically since World War II. And so that was 36%. And if you so Western's rate of voting in 2014 was 16%. But in 2018, when we did the same study, our voting rates nearly doubled from 2014 to 2018. And what we're waiting to see is what happened in 2020 when we get our next report to see what concrete impacts we've had with the work that we've been doing for about 5 years now, because our Democracy Coalition was founded officially in late 2015. And so we've been doing substantive work here, and what students start to see is they start to see that the habits that they're helping create, right, in themselves and in their peers are those habits that we're expecting to see in the future when those nurses and those business people and teachers walk across stage when they're in communities. Because if we don't prepare the next generation of our democracy to be engaged in it, then I think we're exposing the Achilles heel of our democracy. And that's without youth that are committed and engaged, who then become not youth in the future. If they start to lose faith in our democracy, I think we're going to be in for a world of real trouble at that point. So I think it's so important that we can embed, or that we can invest time and energy so that students can learn the value of voting and to start to create those habits early. So I just really wanted to talk through that one sort of point, because I think it's very important to the work that we do at Western, and it's the thing that I think is quite valuable as I invest my time in helping students better understand the value of their vote.
No, I think that's an excellent point, Lane. and while voting comes along every 2 years or 4 years, and we tend to think of it that way, and we tend to think of it as lever pulling, but we're looking at, if we step way back from that, we're talking about the informative process, and that's really where it's at. And we only need look back on the last couple of weeks without going there to look at what the lack of that results in. Well, you can be informed in a lot of different ways, and in fact, these kids, these folks, and even people our age are being impacted with an assault of information, and it becomes a question of like how you make sense of all of that. I'd like to go back to the idea that when you and I we've had some conversations when you talked about the idea of disruption of habitual actions and habitual ways of thinking. I added that. And being able to be a flexible thinker, I added that. That to me, that if we can't have that as an outcome of K to 16 education, we have failed ultimately big time. That you're able to think about disrupting your way of thinking. And you may need to help me work this out a little bit, but I mean just the habitual thinking would be what we walk into an equation with, right? And what we walk out of it with. The disruption would be the walking out of it. And there's bad disruption and good disruption, and you can, place your markers where those are. I'm sure people across the political social spectrum would, but there is the idea of having a flexible notion of thinking about the way that you act upon things. Okay, that's my best shot to give you a talking point.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really important departure point. And I think of this concept, as I was sort of chucking it out there in our previous conversations as we were noodling on how to frame our time together today, would give respects to the disaster sociologist Charles Fritz, who talks a lot about the impacts of disasters, right? Primarily natural disasters is what he studied. And he talks about the disruption of habitual action that stands on the other side of that. And it's sort of like, it opens up sort of a space in some ways for some versions of innovation, right? Like an example I give is if you see a stoplight and a tornado is coming, right? You're not gonna stop at the stoplight. You're gonna probably run through the stoplight because you're gonna try to get out of harm's way, right? So that's a disruption of habitual action. Stopping at a stoplight is a habitual action. If you've been driving for 20 some odd years like me, you don't even think about stopping at a stoplight anymore. It just sort of naturally happens. And that is informed, if you want to study more on that, from David Kimber's work with this critical reflection survey, who spends extensive amount of times talking about the concept of habitual action, understanding, reflection, critical reflection. And I do this orb-like maneuver around it because this is an extension that some students at Canterbury and my former PhD supervisor, Billy Osteen, and I sort of noodled on, and have come up with this idea that we spend most of our life within a habitual action orbit. Sometimes we'll spin out to understanding, every once in a while critical, every once in a while reflection, and then ever so often we go into critical reflection, which is the tool that leads you to some transformative thought, right? Some like, if you're having transformative, earth-shattering thoughts every day about stuff, like you are either a very good philosopher, especially if you can write it down to where others can understand it, or you're probably not really having earth-shattering thoughts every day, right? Like that outside area of deep critical reflection that leads to what Mesereau might refer to as disorientation, right? Disorientating dilemmas is the cornerstone of transformational learning, and can be really painful. It can be painful behaviorally. You touch a fire, that can be a transformable experience. It's a bit of a disorientation if your hand's burnt. That doesn't feel very good. But we also have to realize that there's other comfort zones that you live in around your affective and your cognitive. And a lot of times our affective and cognitive cycles run into disorientation as well. And that is painful in a different way than burning your hand, but it can still be very painful if you realize that you are very, very deeply wrong about something that you've been thinking about in a certain way for a very long time. And more importantly than thinking about it that way, you've been doing about it that way. That can be very, very disorientating, right? It's a simple concept in theory, but I want to circle back to after that riff on habitual action. Charles Fritz talks about this idea of a disruption of habitual action. And there's been 2 times I've seen this up close and personal firsthand. One was in Christchurch, New Zealand, after 7.1 earthquake hit our city center there, and then a subsequent set of aftershocks led to the city center being 66% destroyed, the life of nearly 200 lives lost from buildings that had fallen. It was a very, very difficult time. But in that 6-month period of time, and even still, this was back in 2010, they're still working to recover from that earthquake. And I'm not saying anything to discount the long recovery that's existed, but what I want to circle back to is the response that happened from the students there, which was the Student Volunteer Army and a young man named Sam Johnson. Just Google it. There's a whole Wikipedia page about the Student Volunteer Army in New Zealand and the impact that Sam Johnson and Jason Pemberton and Andrew Chalmers and a bunch of other people came together to help create, that wound up engaging 9,000 students essentially through the Student Volunteer Army to give back to the community and to engage with the community and to help lend a hand in a time when the community was literally shaken to its core. And we like to, Billy and I always like to say, when we were there, were shaken and stirred into action. And the students led the charge there. And then the university came on behind the scenes and said, what can we do to support you? What do you need? How can I help? Right? And the university worked with the students to help support them. And subsequently, the university has now put community engagement as one of their 4 primary pillars. There's a set of courses around community resilience and social entrepreneurship and engagement, the first of its kind in New Zealand at a university. And so you start to see that massive disorientation that came on the other side of that, that shook and stirred 9,000 some odd students and youth to being what I would argue to say like the hotbed and the epicenter of youth engagement in the world. I mean, there's some amazing stuff happening in Christchurch, New Zealand, all based on the response and the disruption of habitual action that was going on leading up into that point in time when it came to youth. They were noticing decreases in youth engagement when it came to volunteerism, the concept of working bees, where you would do working bees in New Zealand and lots of Kiwis would come out and help put a roof on someone's house or help clean up the community. They saw that going away, declines in Rotary memberships, and all these sorts of things were happening, much like what you see happening in the United States in some capacities. But New Zealand saw that, and then with this earthquake, the students said, this one particular student who put his flag in this particular topic was Sam Johnson, and he said, I'm sick of the perceptions that non-youth have of youth, and I'm sick of youth not being as engaged as I know that we can be. And that was like his premise. And that was an internal calling, if we want to hark to the hero's journey. This person, Sam, was working on this for years before anything happened. And then boom, the external call came, the knock on the door. And it happened to be an earthquake that was right outside that door. And from that earthquake, the youth responded. And so that was a major example of this idea of a disruption of habitual action leading to a completely new environment. And the last thing I'll say, and we don't have to go into great detail because I know we're at our hour, is we're living this right now globally with COVID-19. You see sort of new environmental conditions that are affording themselves to innovation. Right? I say higher education alone, right? If you just look at this one industry, we've been thrust 10 to 15 years into the future. Some might say it's where we should have already been, but 10 to 15 years into the future when it comes to having online and virtual courses at institutions that are regional comprehensive institutions with 80% of courses being offered virtually, right? We were bricks and mortar campuses in our own right, but we had to pivot overnight to meet our students where they were in a safe environment. And so that is a component of this concept called the edge effect. In ecology, it's essentially just where 2 habitats come into contact with one another. and a sort of marginal habitat manifests between the two. So you have like a pond, and then you have like the place that's not the pond, the bank. And then in between those two, you have micro marginal overlap spaces. And this concept is called the edge effect. We're in the edge effect right now. There were things that happened before COVID. There will be things that happen on the other side of it. But right now we're in the place that's overlap between the two. And what edge effect states is that there's a complete different body of organisms, right? In our sake, I would say resources, attitudes, dispositions, people, resources that exist within this space, that if we can learn, right, and be adaptable, as you noted earlier, Joe, if we can learn and be adaptable in this time and space we're in right now, when we move on the other side of it, you know, we're going to have a completely different understanding of that environment, right? We're not just going to go back to how things were before we came into the space we're in right now. There's going to be some transferable knowledge that moves forward into the future with us. And now that the cost that it's taken for us to be able to do that is literally earth shattering and life shattering. But I think that concept of where we are right now is that there is this habitual disruption of action. At the same time, I would say we've probably fallen into some habits now because we've been in this environment for so long. So I don't know. That's an interesting point that you brought back up, though.
And we could talk further for sure. I think the idea of habitual disruption of action is core, and it's been an ongoing conversation with many folks that I've talked to in education, K to 16. Lane, I want to thank you so much for your time and being available to us. And we're going to close now with the Spotlight series.
Okay.
But I want to thank you so much.
Thank you, Joe. I appreciate getting to work with the Community Works Institute. And on this, the last thing I want to say on this weekend is we're moving into a long weekend with MLK Day coming up on Monday. I want to just point towards one quote that I like in its own right, but then I like this extension that's been added onto it. And so Martin Luther King Jr. said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." We know this quote. But Eric Holder sort of extended that concept by saying it only bends because we push and pull on it. And I think that there's so much power in that idea as we move into what I hope is a reflective weekend for everyone.
Well, we hope so, for sure. And thank you again for your time, Lane. And we will meet again soon. Eh?
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you. Take care.
Have a nice week.